So now what we need to do is to think about the comparison between what we call our crude measure of association and our adjusted measure of association. So if you remember, our original measure of association between gender and malaria, that was 1.7. So that is what we are going to refer to as our crude measure of association. That crude measure is basically the unadjusted measure of association between our variables of interest. Now, what we did in the last slide was we calculated stratum-specific measures. And if you remember, our stratum-specific measures, these were 1.06 and 1.00. To calculate an adjusted measure of association for the strata-specific measures, there's a way to do this in terms of like statistical calculations, mathematical calculations that is above what we're going to cover in this class. For this class, what you would do is you would just take an average of these two numbers, assuming that they are very similar. If they are very different from one another, you're not going to be taking an average. That is another phenomenon that we see. But assuming that these stratum-specific measures are similar to one another, we are going to calculate an adjusted measure of association, which would just be the average. So the average basically between 1.06 and 1.00 is going to be something like 1.03. So we are going to compare our crude measure of association, that 1.7, for the association between male gender and malaria. We are now going to compare that to our adjusted measure of association, which is going to be that 1.03. So again, we're comparing our crude, that 1.7, our unadjusted measure of association. We're going to compare that to our adjusted measure of association, which is the average of those stratum-specific numbers, which is going to be 1.03. That adjusted measure is essentially our measure after we control for that working outside variable. So to determine whether working outside is actually confounding the relationship between gender and malaria status, we have to see, is there at least a 10% change between that crude measure, that 1.7, and our adjusted measure, that 1.03. To determine whether we have at least a 10% change, we use this equation here. You take the odds ratio or the relative risk, it doesn't matter. You take the crude measure of association, you subtract the measure of association for the adjusted, and then you divide by the measure of association for the adjusted. Now, in this case, I would plug in these numbers and I would see that, okay, my crude is 1.7. I subtract 1.03, that adjusted measure of association, and then I divide by 1.03, and I get times 100, that is 65%. So it definitely appears that the adjusted measure of association is a lot more than 10% different from that crude measure of association. It is 65%. So we can conclude based on this that that percent change is pretty high. It's much more than 10%. I would conclude that yes, working outside confounds the relationship between gender and malaria. So in summary, what we've determined from this example is that working outside is a confounder for the association between gender and malaria. We have a greater than 10% change between that crude and that adjusted, and it meets all of those characteristic requirements in terms of being associated with the exposure and the outcome variable. Therefore, because it's confounding that relationship, that crude or that unadjusted measure that I calculated first, looking at the relationship between gender and malaria, that is a biased estimate. It is not a valid estimate because I have confounding present, confounding from that working outside. So The best estimate, or the better estimate in terms of measuring the effect of gender on developing malaria, the most valid measure I want to use is going to be that adjusted measure, which is going to be that 1.03. What I see is that when I adjust for working outside, I no longer observe that positive association, that 1.7. When I adjust, now I observe a measure of association of 1.03. And 1.03 is essentially 1. So after I adjust for working outside, I actually see that there really is no association between male gender and malaria status. Working outside confounded that relationship, so I have to adjust. I have to take into account that working outside variable in order to try and remove that bias from my research results.